Hey everybody, it's Chris and Rick Talk Guitars. I'm Rick, and that's Chris over there.
Howdy.
Hi. We decided to talk about a book today, and it would kind of, I don't know, I think we can recommend this book, right? Because it's really good. If you haven't read it, a lot of guitar people have probably read it, but Chris and I read it and just found it a really cool accounting of the birth of the electric guitar. I mean, it's called The Birth of Loud. The subtitle is Leo, Fender, and Les Paul, and the Guitar Pioneering Rivalry That Shaped Rock and Roll. And the author is Ian S. Port. And this book, I couldn't put it down because it just did such a good job of telling this story from all the aspects, right? From the aspect of Fender, Gibson, even Paul Bigsby, and all the other players within this universe of guitar people. So
yeah, just capturing the climate of the time during that like mad scientist inventor rush that gave us the modern electric guitar. It's just a fascinating romp through that era. I mean, on both coasts and in between.
Yeah, I felt the same way. And so we just wanted to talk about it and recommend the book for those who haven't read it. And for those who have read it, chime in on social media and tell us your favorite parts. And Chris and I are going to just talk about it because we both, after reading it, we both got on the phone and just had good conversations about all the aspects of it. But for me, the thing that was just so cool, that it's a reminder of, you know, we came around at a time when electric guitars were already all over the place, right?
Yeah, well established.
Electric guitars were well established. But, you know, you got to be reminded of the fact that there were no electric guitars at one time, and there was this philosophy about guitars in the guitar community that was, you know, so entrenched, you know, luthiers building, you know, fine instruments and stuff like that. And then when the Tele came out, you know, some people thought it was just a plank of wood that any ding dong with a bandsaw could produce. But I just thought it was really fascinating to kind of revisit that and go, God, yeah, there was a time when this thing seemed like it was dropped out of the sky, you know, as this weird thing that you plug in and so different from previous guitars.
Right, and that's the thing about guitar players. I'm sure it was true back then and it's true now. So many are such traditionalists. Yeah. Seeing something like that must have been, no, that's not a guitar, that's blah, blah, it's a canoe paddle or whatever they called it. One thing I thought was really cool, too, was there was a rush for people to create the solid body guitar. And there were many attempts before, you know, the big ones. But I thought it was interesting that you've had your inventors saying, we need a solid body guitar. I've been trying, here's the one I made, here's the one I made. You know, it's not really there yet. But the guitar players, like Merle Travis, he like drew. Yep. He knew what he wanted. He's like, I'm tired of feedback or whatever. I want this, and he drew a picture of it. This thing came about, the solid body electric guitar, from the inventor's standpoint and the guitar standpoint, and everybody was like kind of mingling and sharing ideas to get us to that place.
Exactly.
And the rivalry in that book, it captures that really well. And, you know, all through both Leo and Les Paul's lives, they talked about, like, what was first. And, you know, it was just kind of like they were clinging to their versions. In the end, as guitar players, we don't care.
Exactly.
Both of those people.
It's win-win, yeah.
Yeah, knocked it out of the park.
Totally.
And we've yet to do anything better or, you know, they pretty much nailed it from the get-go.
And speaking of that rivalry, that's another thing I just dug about this book is the early years when they were all in California. Les Paul had moved to California, and Leo was obviously there. And, you know, they'd go over to Les's house and shoot the shit about guitars and, you know, oh, what are you doing? And at that time, it was more of a friendship, maybe a friendly rivalry, you know. No, totally. But as time went on, it became more of a real rivalry.
Shit got real.
Yeah, shit got real. But I dug reading about that time period because it just seemed so cool. Like, you know, exactly like you were saying, they were serving a need. Like guitar players at the time were playing semi-hollow or hollow body guitars and some semi-hollow body guitars, and then they would try to plug those into amps, but they obviously got feedback and stuff. And so they're going, well, you know, the players are going, well, I'd love a guitar that I could plug in and get, and they wanted to be loud, right? Because they were in a band context. So, so the guitar was always drowned out because it couldn't get loud enough, right? And Les Paul was a real inventor and a real innovator because he built his own guitars. He built that aluminum guitar that had no headstock. But yeah, I just dug that kind of friendly rivalry as it started out in California. And then as things progressed, it started to get, you know, like you say, shit got real. And But I just envisioned these guys in the sunny atmosphere, you know, picking fruit from their citrus trees, talking about guitars and shit. It was really cool.
It painted a really good picture of that. So you can really visualize, you know, that era and that kind of like, you know, they're hanging out in Les Paul's garage talking about stuff. One thing that I found interesting was like when they're talking about like the materials used to make the first solid body electric guitars. You think about today, the guitarist who goes into the shop and he's like, I'm going to get a Telecaster. I want a really light one. They like, back then it was the exact opposite. Resonance, they were trying to get rid of like any sort of resonance and just make it, you know, about the pickup and the strings.
Yeah.
And now it's like kind of turned around where it's like, yes, I want a Telecaster that's really resonant, unplugged, and it sounds good. But that was for the furthest thing from their mind. You know?
Totally, and especially Les Paul, because he got it. He got it right away. He said, no, I just want a pickup that's going to pick up the strings, the vibration of these strings, so it doesn't matter what it's attached to. And that's why he built it out of aluminum. He's like, it doesn't matter what the material is. I want to be able to plug this thing into an amp, have it not feedback, you know, and be loud enough to be heard in a band context. So he was building these crazy things. He called them, what did he call them? He called them some name like...
Oh, I remember know what you're saying, but I don't remember what it was.
But anyway, he, you know, and Mary Ford would refer to these crazy guitars that he built as these whatever clunkers, I think.
Oh yeah,
clunkers.
That's it.
But they were cool because that, to me, at that time period, to understand that and to make that connection, I think is huge, right? Because like we were talking about, there's a paradigm that's established. It's like, no, this is what a guitar is. It's this acoustic thing that's finely crafted by these luthiers and
hundreds of years of tradition.
Exactly. And Les is like, well, that's all well and good, but here's what I need. And like the artists were saying that too. And that's another thing I dug about Leo is he was so in tune with listening to players. He'd go to shows and he'd watch them play and he'd go up on stage and tinker with things.
Yeah.
You know, and then get off stage. And that is invaluable because he wasn't doing this in a vacuum. None of this was happening in a vacuum, but Leo especially I think was so cool because he really got it in terms of like serving these musicians, right? Like what problems are you encountering? Okay, well let's try to address those. And that's what he did. And again, another thing I dug was the way Leo came about it or went about it versus Gibson, right? Gibson was that traditional staid company where we have luthiers that have done it, and Leo's like, well, that's great, but I want to build a guitar that can be easily repaired,
right?
That's sturdy, that's going to stay in tune, yes, inexpensively made, but in terms of quality, affordable.
Better term.
But he wanted to build quality instruments that met that criteria.
Yeah, no, that's because I've run into people who say that Leo Fender, his contribution was he wanted to make things cheaply.
Yeah.
No, he wanted to make things affordably.
Yeah.
But you know, serviceability and quality was a big part of
exactly
what he strove for, and he got it.
I think so too. And to that point, early on in the Fender story, when they were building all these guitars and they were having a lot of quality issues, remember? And it was a big deal with the company. That's when like they kind of made this shift to really focus on quality, and like they burned all of this old stock that they had. Like they just burned it, like that was either returned or whatever. And then that was kind of the birth of like really trying to pay attention of meeting the criteria that I set out to, but in a quality-minded way.
Right. I mean, I've played like broadcasters, and there's like a homemade, made in someone's garage quality to those things.
Yeah.
You just feel it's like this seems handmade by one person, and they slowly dialed that out. So they had this quality standard that they set up. You know, they definitely got more consistent.
Exactly. But I just dug that because they're just totally different schools of thought, right? And Gibson again wanted to produce this, you know, beautiful instrument that was really geared more to professionals too, right? And that's another thing that I think Leo, not only him as an engineer and a designer, but his whole marketing staff and sales team wanted to market these guitars to beginners and people who may not, you know what I mean? Like they weren't professionals. I mean, he was trying to accommodate professionals because he was trying to be inclusive. But he was trying to be inclusive of saying like we're not just offering these to professionals. We're offering these to anybody who wants to learn how to play guitar or is intermediate or whatever. You know, whereas Gibson, and I think Gibson obviously wanted to do that too, but in terms of their mindset about how they thought about their products, I think they thought about them much more preciously, right?
Like more of like an East Coast jazz vibe. Yeah, it's like we're serving these types of musicians. You know, our guitars are going to have a set neck, like the 100-year-old method of putting a neck on a guitar, and you know they're going to be carved and have all the. You know, one thing that's really interesting about that was you look at that. And, the Gibson guitar was way more, seemed way more costly to build.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot more. But the price difference wasn't that big. If you consider inflation and all that stuff, the gap isn't that huge.
That's true.
It's not like as huge as it is today, I don't think.
Yeah, I think that's true, and that's an interesting point, too. I was kind of interested in seeing the prices too from that far back, that I thought they seemed kind of high for that time period, actually.
For the Fenders, it's like, here it is, we got a bolt-on neck, slap these things out together,
Yeah, because a brand new car, like in the 60s and stuff, costs like $2,000 or something.
Right.
But I thought that was interesting too, to see those prices.
It was right around the $300 mark, right? For the first Les Paul.
Exactly.
And Telecaster was like $260 or something like that.
So not a lot of difference in price.
Probably not exactly right on those numbers, but it just made me say, wow, that's not a huge difference. If you think about it today, you can get a standard Fender Stratocaster for what, like 12, like retail or something like that? And there's like 3 for a Gibson or something like that.
Right, yeah.
So, the margin wasn't as wide.
Yeah. And another thing I dug was the Paul Bigsby aspect of it too.
Oh,
he was
cool,
a character, and he was cool, and he was a guy that could do all of that stuff by himself. He could do, the designing and the machine work and all that other crap. And he fancied himself just like a builder of fine instruments, really. He didn't see himself as a mass production guy.
No, he was more of a one-off guy.
Yeah, and I thought it was funny how Leo Fender and Les Paul both, didn't admit to borrowing that Merle Travis guitar,
right,
and checking it out, which they did. There's proof that they did, that they borrowed that guitar from Paul Bigsby, and at the time too, it was cool that he wasn't really even like competitive in terms of like caring, you know what I mean, about that stuff until he saw the Strat. And he saw the headstock, and he saw things that were like, hey, that's a ripoff of the stuff I put into this initial guitar. And then he's like, God damn it. But I thought he sounded like a really cool character to me.
No, they all just seemed like cool, like weird old, like mad scientist people. And you know what? One of the things when I was reading this book, I kept picturing in my mind was this story as like a TV series like Mad Men, what I mean?
Totally.
That captured the era, the sales force,
and
the advertising, and just the crazy like little bit of drama. Because this book is written in a very like fiction. It's written a lot like fiction, and that's what makes it really good. When I got that book, I'm like, do I really need to read another book about Leo Fender or Les Paul? But obviously I did, because it was great, and like you said, I like read it in 2 nights.
Yeah,
it's a real page turner.
Yeah, because the storytelling was just so well done. And that's what I enjoyed about the book too. And it's all, it's covered in a way that it's not done in a vacuum. It's just done in he refers to like the musicians that Leo was talking to at the time, like the country players, and Dick Dale, for instance, he was another innovator. Really, he pushed the limits of amplifier manufacturing, because he wanted more power. He kept blowing speakers. And the way he played was really aggressive, and he wanted to be loud, and that was his style. And he hit it off with Leo, and they worked together to create these heavy-duty amps with 15-inch speakers and huge transformers that would withstand the abuse that Dick Dale would put these amps through. I thought that was so cool.
I know, just like certain artists that were responsible for so many things that we can go out and buy now. Just like their input. Yeah. The Stratocaster had input from a lot of people. Oh, totally. And that was interesting how that came to be. And one thing it's hard to believe right now is Leo Fender, when he created the Telecaster, he thought, oh, great, I got, my vision, this part of my vision is out, I've created this. And then when he came up with the Stratocaster, he got that to do away with the Telecaster. He thought that no one would buy a Telecaster now that the Stratocaster was available, because that was his premier guitar. But people still, to this day, I mean, they're different. He didn't grasp the different models, the value of different models back then. He just thought one would make the other obsolete.
Yeah, and I thought that was so fascinating too. And again, I guess you got to just go back to the time period and what he was thinking, and how he, the feedback he was getting from guitar players and everybody else. In his mind, he probably, it was probably justified. He's like, okay, well, the Telecaster is going to die a slow death or an instant death after this. I've made this other guitar that's better. But again, like you're saying, it's like that's the cool thing about like all these models and how they've come into their own over time. Like juniors and things like that. Like, there was a time when people were like dismissive of these guitars, but over time people gravitated towards them and go, God, this suits me as a player, and I love it. I love the Tele, right?
It's its own thing. Yeah,
it's its own thing.
The Les Paul Jr. Yeah. It's like, it's a student model guitar that we decided, hey, we should we could make, there's a market for getting people into the guitar. The first guitar, let's make an affordable one, and they end up creating a model that stands out so much on its own. It's just a model to have.
But and again, I just reading about the evolution of electric guitars was so, because you and I both read articles or books that kind of cover it, but it's not as comprehensive as this or as well written, I think. But it's just always good to be reminded of like the way things were at a certain point in time, like even the music, right? Like rock and roll was not a thing in the late 40s, early 50s. And then, the convergence of these electric guitars and this new form of music that was happening was such a cool combination, right? Because you had these people who wanted to play this new form of music who also wanted new ways they needed new ways to express themselves, right? So it's like, oh, here comes these guitars that are kind of, well, totally different, right? The way the body styles are, the paint, everything. And it's like, oh, that suits this new form of music that's just coming into its own. I thought that was so cool.
Right. And one thing that I kind of take for granted myself is that before Leo Fender, there was no mass-produced electric bass guitar. That was from outer space for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Like, what the hell is this?
Right.
I mean, I hear a bass, but I don't see a bass out there. I just see guitars.
Yeah.
And that, something that didn't exist, like in a way that you could go out and buy the electric bass guitar. So that's cool. I mean, even if Leo Fender only did that, and that was all he ever did, he would still be noted in the history of rock and roll.
Oh, it's huge.
That.
Yeah.
And then you add the other things he did, and it's just pretty incredible.
No, but the bass thing was another revelation to me, too. Because exactly, again, hearing from, bass players, it's like, I don't want to have to carry this huge doghouse thing around, in a station wagon full of gear. We had to put it on the roof and stuff, and sometimes it falls off, and it's hard. And also they mentioned too that it is a pain in the ass to play because there's no frets, all this other stuff. And that was a huge revelation. And I loved it how they touched on Carol Kaye, and she's like, she was a guitar player at the time, but she was kind of frustrated because of the stuff that she was playing. She was a jazz player initially.
Right. Yeah.
And then she kind of got this bug when she saw the electric bass. She's like, oh, that's cool. I'll do that. She bought 2 Precisions like in the 60s.
Right.
And then she started to do more sessions as a bass player. And she, as we know, she played on some of the most iconic music, Beach Boys stuff and all that other stuff. But
and that was really interesting too, to see these guitars, if you think back to what the climate was then, like Carol Kaye, where it's like, oh, this thing exists now.
Yeah.
I can do my thing. And they go on to create, their contribution to rock and roll, like, with a Stratocaster. There was, Dick Dale was, one of them, but there was also the Hank Marvin.
Yeah.
And what's his name? Buddy Holly.
Yeah.
I mean, he'd like that. His sound is so much the Stratocaster.
Oh,
I mean,
totally.
those songs in the Stratocaster are just so ingrained. Like, I don't know what it would have been like if he would have had, a Gibson or something like that. So, I mean, just seeing those things come together, and converge, rock and roll and the birth of the electric guitar, it was really cool.
Yeah.
And they told that story really well.
Oh, yeah. I dug that too. I just dug. And it's cool because the way it was written is you're just seeing it coming, right? It's like this train in the distance. Mm-hmm. They're building these guitars, and then on the other side of the, tunnel is this freight train coming towards you that's rock and roll. And in that vein, it reminds me of talking about Gibson, like they, came out with the Burst Les Paul that really didn't do much. And the Les Paul at the time was really not selling at all.
Right.
And then Gibson's like, well, shit, okay, well, we're not going to make these guitars anymore. They made the SG, which Les Paul hated because he hated the horns and all this other crap, and he didn't want to put his name on it. But then, meanwhile, in Europe, these young guitar players somehow got a hold of a Burst, and they're like, damn, this thing is cool. And then so now they all want a Burst. And so literally people were going to Les Paul's house, mm-hmm. and going, hey, I want to buy a Les Paul from you. And he's like, well, I'm not Gibson. What do you want from me?
No, because that was like the birth of like the artist endorsement, where you're just seeing, not a straight up endorsement, but just like picking up a record and seeing a guitar player with a certain type of guitar and going, I need that guitar.
Yeah.
It worked on both sides of the ocean.
Yeah, but I just thought that was, the picture in my mind was just so vivid of these people knocking on Les Paul's door and him coming to the door and saying, and again, like, like for Clapton, he's one of those English players that made the Les Paul desirable to all these other players, because he's, at the time he was the Blues Breakers, and he's had that Beano Les Paul, and he's playing through that Marshall Bluesbreaker amp and getting this just crazy sounds out of that thing. And so, sure enough, all these, young guitar players are like, God, that's what I want. I want this full-throated, freight train sound. Where can I got to get me one of those. Well, they only made, a few hundred of those bursts, and so,
right.
And then in the late 60s, sure enough, Gibson started to reintroduce the Les Pauls into their canon of guitars again. Yeah, I thought that was cool. And again, like, the thing I liked about it too is just they talked about all these characters pretty honestly, as people. Right. That's another thing I really dug about it. It's like, they didn't lionize any of these people. They just told you, they were, like Les Paul, for instance, he sounds like he was a complicated guy. All of them were, they're right. Human beings.
No, totally.
But I dug that. I dug it that they didn't just like make it seem like they were these icon gods that, you know what I mean?
Right,
like left out some parts of their lives that, Yeah. So, I mean, I just think for any guitar player, you got to read this book. It's so well written, and it covers the evolution of the electric guitar so well. And I just think I've read other, publications and stuff that kind of cover it in a vacuum, like it just seems like it doesn't talk enough about what's going on around it, and this really did right. for me.
Yeah. It just mostly talks about the business and, the instruments and things like that, where this is like a story. Like I said, it's like fiction.
Exactly.
So you get the feeling that you're reading a fiction. You can visualize it. It's written in a way that you can actually visualize the times and everything else. So,
and I loved it. Yeah, and I loved it the way they talked about like the sales force for Fender,
right? Because
they were like, like Don Randall and those people were just like they were in it and they were bought in and they were trying to sell this stuff and it's so cool to see how they marketed the guitars, right?
Right.
That was totally new. They marketed it as like kind of like an accessory. It wasn't just a guitar. It was like, they introduced like these colors, right? Like the automobile colors and stuff like that to their guitars. And, Gibson again, they had like, sunbursts and more wood tone, more conservative stuff at the time. And then sure enough, as things progressed, they came out with the V and the Explorer and the Modern or whatever, all that stuff to try to kind of keep up with all this stuff, the change, the social stuff that was happening I thought that was really cool.
That was really cool.
Yeah. And another thing I dug was the whole CBS thing, Oh, yeah. Leo was like a chronic worrier or, he had stress all the time and it manifested itself in a physical way with him. Like he had that infection forever.
Strap
yeah.
Or whatever.
And so he finally, and I thought it was really fascinating how when CBS was like auditing, Fender and all that stuff, and they were coming, to the conclusion, well, none of these people have degrees in engineering or any of this other shit. It's like, who are these yahoos,
That's what was so cool about
it.
Yeah. No, that was great. I'd never really seen that deep into that, the sale aspect of it from the way that they told it in the story.
Yeah, and me too. And I thought that was really cool because I think it shows how just Leo's passion and the passion that all those people had for building these instruments and stuff and listening to players trumped, formal education's great, but Leo had a gift for this stuff and he had his radio repair stuff and all this stuff. So he had experience doing this, but I just thought it was cool how like his sales team, everybody at Fender really didn't have formal degrees, but they were making this thing work. And
right.
And at the time, they sold the company for $13 million, which was just unheard of. Don Randall was beside himself because he thought, we'll get $3 million maybe or something,
right.
But $13 million it ended up getting for the company. But I just thought that was cool. And then of course, the CBS years, all those bean counter dickheads.
One thing I wasn't really aware of before was how scared Fender was of solid state technology because he wasn't trained for that.
Right.
That was like, more, he was just like taught himself tubes, and that's, easy for someone to take on. But, the advent of transistor stuff, he's like, I'm going to be out of a job. I can't, I don't know this stuff well enough.
Yeah.
So that was pretty interesting because I had never thought of that before. And then interestingly enough, they come out with the first solid state amps and they're just dog crap.
Right. No, I thought that was cool too because I had no idea about that too, but it was fascinating to see where he kind of saw his own limitations as an engineer. It's like, well, I know this stuff, but I know nothing about transistors, and if once that stuff takes over, I'm done. Yeah, I thought that was really fascinating. So a little bit of
insecurity on his part. This dude that did all these revolutionary things is like kind of like scared of transistors coming down the road.
Yeah, I thought that was fascinating too. Well, cool, man. Yeah, I'm so glad you recommended that book to me. I totally dug it. It's a page turner. We recommend it again. It's The Birth of Loud. It's a great book. Go out and get it or borrow it from your friends. Again, 2020, we're in a new year. We're going to try to hit it hard, man. And keep listening if you're out there, and check us out on social media. Chris, you got anything to say?
No, just, again, anybody listening, thank you so much.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. Yeah, we dig doing this. All right. Signing off. Talk to you later.
Goodbye.